All right, the 1% rule. What's that all about? Where did that come from? And who made that up? So the 1% rule was a rule of thumb that became popular, I don't know, about 10 years ago, kind of coming off the tail end of the housing market crash, 2000, whatever, 10 to 15, somewhere in there. And at the time, you could find properties that would meet that 1% rule. So for easy examples, if you bought a house for say 300,000, the 1% rule would say you'd rent that for $3,000 a month. So you could find houses that you could buy for 300,000 that would rent for 3,000 a month. So that was the rule of thumb to buy rentals. Where that got to be kind of misrepresented is some people use that as a calculation on it has to meet that 1% rule and didn't run the numbers behind it. That 1% rule was just kind of a gauge, a rule of thumb to kind of estimate if that property would cash flow or not. So where they got that number is it's not really what they call a 1% rule. It's actually a monthly gross rent multiplier. It's a formula. And that formula is like a cap rate, capitalization rate, return on the money you invest. So if it's a rule of thumb that's been around the real estate industry for eons and eons, the gross rent multiplier formula. And what that does is it allows an investor to take a look at a property and determine what the value should be and what the rent should be with a real quick estimate. So they can just look at a property, and they can tell you what the price should be, and based on the rents, or based on the rents, or based on the price, tell you what the rent should be. So it's a handy tool to know and how to use. Unfortunately, when YouTube came out, they started just teaching this stuff as the 1% rule and never explained where that came from. So I'll kind of walk you through what the gross rent multiplier is. So the gross rent multiplier is your annual gross rent. So we'll use that 1% rule on 300,000. So if you go 3,000 times 12, you're at 36,000 a year gross rents. That's your annual gross rent. And then you divide 300,000, that's the price, by 36,000. So that's an 8.3 gross rent multiplier. Okay, so in residential, single family, duplex, under 4 units, we don't really use gross rent for annual terms. That's more of a commercial property analysis. So 8.3 doesn't mean much to us, but if you're in the commercial world, it would mean a lot more to you there, because they talk in terms of annual gross rent or annual rent versus monthly. In residential, we deal in terms of monthly. So the gross rent multiplier can be calculated in a monthly format. So that monthly format would be, again, the 1% rule would take 300,000 times 1% would be $3,000 a month rent. So the monthly gross rent multiplier would be 300,000 divided by 100 equals 3,000 monthly rent. So the gross rent multiplier of the 1% rule is 100. So why is the gross rent multiplier a better formula than the 1% rule? Well, take 3,000, your monthly rent, times 100 is 300,000. You can work that formula backwards and forwards. Or 300,000 divided by 100 equals 3,000 a month rent. So no matter what part of the formula I have, you can solve for the price or the rent. That's the value, or that's the power of the monthly gross rent multiplier formula. So the markets change, interest rates drop, house prices start to go up. You can no longer find properties that meet the 1% rule. So can you still buy rental properties? Yes, people are doing it and still cash flowing. The market shifted. So the 1% rule doesn't work anymore, and everyone that learned the 1% rule is kind of scratching their head going, huh? Because they didn't understand how to calculate the returns without that rule of thumb. So a lot of people sat on the sidelines expecting a housing crash and missed out on some huge gains. So let's say the formula changes a little bit. and this is the formula I've been using for a while, is 120. So instead of 100, it's 120. So we take $3,000 a month gross rent times 120 is 360,000 instead of 300,000. And so you can work that number backwards. Take 360,000 divided by 120 is $3,000 a month. So that's where the market's been at for a while, is that 120 gross rent multiplier. What we're seeing out there and what people are struggling with is, with the rates shooting up, we're seeing gross rent multiplier of 140. So what if you take $3,000 gross rent a month times 140, that's $420,000 for the house. You take $420,000 divided by 140, that's $3,000 a month. Now, I'll tell you right now, when you run the numbers on a gross rent multiplier of 140, it will not cash flow. You can run the numbers. I'll promise you it won't cash flow. So the market had been floating around 120, and then rates are coming up. Sometimes it might cash flow at 120, but it's starting to trend back to, you need that gross rent multiplier to be closer to that 100 because of the higher rents, higher insurance costs, and higher taxes to make that cash flow. So lately I've been rerunning numbers, and I'm coming in closer to 110 is where that gross rent multiplier kind of needs to be, depending on what area you're in and what the taxes are. So to make this a little easier, I'll share a screen here. We're going to take, this is calculators on my website, Property Investment Calculator. You take your purchase price of $300,000, do your 20% down. We'll say taxes of $3,200, 7.6 interest rate, 30-year mortgage, say $210 for monthly insurance. We're going to leave out all these expenses for now, just so we don't have too many variables as we're trying to explain this. And we're going to use $3,000 a month rent. So then you hit calculate. So we have $36,000 gross rent for year one, net operating income of $30,280. So the cap rate is at 10.09%. Cash on cash returns like 20%. Gross rent multiplier is 8.33. The gross rent multiplier is 100. That's your 1% rule. And then first year cash flow is $9,900. First year monthly cash flow is $828. I would love to find these deals again. I haven't seen these in years. What we do know is the markets change. So we're going to say that this price goes up $20,000. Everything else stays the same. Your gross rent multiplier went to 106. Okay. Now let's say it goes to 330. Your gross rent multiplier is 110. And that's probably where it needs to be. You're going to cash flow about $659 without your expenses, right? We didn't put any of those expenses in there, so your cash flow will be lower than that when you fill out your expenses. You probably want to be right around that 110 gross rent multiplier. And you can probably go to, say, 120. Here's 116. So we know you're probably going to need to be somewhere between that 106 and 116. So 105 to 120. If you can get something on there that hits that ballpark. You can play with these numbers when the interest rates change, that gross rent multiplier changes, when the taxes change. It gets you into the ballpark. We're pitching horseshoes right now as you're searching on the MLS, or let's say you're scrolling through Zillow or Homes or whatever website you're using, and you go in and you look at the potential rent, or you know the rents for the market because you're studying your buy box in that area, and you can just kind of multiply that rent times 110 or 120. And is it close to cash flowing? If that number hits close to that list price, you're within striking distance. Now you can run the numbers, you can go look at the property, and you can make an offer. But If you're way apart, it probably doesn't make sense for you to spend much time on it. So that's where this little rule of thumb, gross rent multiplier, comes in handy. Is it kind of weeds out a lot of the dogs for you, and just see, just to gauge if you're in the ballpark of making something work. So I've been able to go into pretty much any market. I've talked to people around the country, and they're trying to find their buy box, so I'll help them out with that. If you got questions, reach out to me, and I can walk you through this. But we'll go into a neighborhood, and we can start picking out properties, and we'll run this formula. Say, okay, your gross rent multiplier needs to be about 105 because your taxes are outrageous here, or your taxes are next to nothing. You can probably go to 120. So it just depends on your area and your expenses. So you'll find where you need to be in your buy box by figuring out where that gross rent multiplier consecutively lands, depending on the property. And then as you search, you're able to rule a lot out just by quickly taking that list price off of Zillow and dividing it by 110 or 120, whatever your gross rent multiplier is, and saying, yeah, that looks like it would rent for that. Or there's no way I'm going to get that kind of rent for it. So that's where this tool comes in handy. So just take that 1% rule and throw it out the window. Whoever came up with that did the world a huge disfavor. I don't know if it came from Bigger Pockets. That's where I heard it. Probably came from somewhere else long before that. But just go with the monthly gross rent multiplier. And if you need this calculator, it's pretty easy to calculate, but this will help you out. And then that'll narrow your search down and kind of speed up the process and make it easier. So then you'd be able to dive into any market around the country and see if you can find properties that cash flow. That's not the way I like to invest. I prefer to invest locally so I can keep an eye on the properties. That's my personal choice on how to run my business, and then how you want to invest is up to you. I know some people live in very expensive areas and want to invest out of state to try to get into less expensive properties and get a little higher yield. So to each their own. But that's all I got for now. If you got questions, reach out to me. Email's on there, or you can just go to my website, craigcammon.com, and then I got a number you can text as well. So without any further information on that, I'm going to sign off, and good luck hunting out there, and hope you find the right deal. So talk to you later.